The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets of Sweetwater Creek as Eliza Morgan darted between buildings, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Blood trickled down her arm where a bullet had grazed her, but she couldn't stop, not with Sheriff Davis and his men closing in. It was 1876, and the bustling mining town that had once been her refuge had become her prison. Eliza's breath came in ragged gasps as she hitched up her skirts and ran, leaving behind everything she owned except for the small leather pouch of coins tied at her waist and her father's pocket watch tucked safely in her bodice. The town's buildings fell away as she plunged into the darkness beyond, guided only by the silver light of a waning moon and the desperate need to escape. She went this way, a gruff voice called out behind her. Find her before dawn or Anderson will have our hides. Eliza pushed forward, her feet stumbling over rocks and roots as she made her way down the hillside. She had no destination in mind, only the fervent desire to put as much distance as possible between herself and the men who wanted her dead or worse. The thought of William Anderson, with his cold eyes and cruel smile, was enough to make her legs pump faster despite the burning in her lungs. After what felt like hours, Eliza came upon a small creek. She waded through the shallow water, hoping it would throw off any dogs they might send after her. The cold water stung her feet but numbed the pain in her injured arm. When she emerged on the other side, she spotted the dark silhouettes of trees in the distance. An orchard, perhaps, or a small wood where she could hide until it was safe to move on. The orchard, as it turned out to be, was an unexpected blessing. Apple trees stood in neat rows, their branches heavy with fruit not yet ripe. In the darkness, Eliza felt her way between the trees until she found one with low, sturdy branches. With trembling arms, she pulled herself up and climbed as high as she dared, settling into a crook where two thick branches met. For 3 days, Eliza remained hidden in the orchard. She descended only at night to drink from a small spring she'd discovered at the edge of the property and to gather fallen apples to quiet her growling stomach. During the day, she dozed fitfully, starting awake at every sound, certain that Sheriff Davis and his men would find her at any moment. On the morning of the 4th day, Eliza woke to the sound of whistling. Her eyes flew open, and she pressed herself against the trunk of the tree, trying to make herself invisible among the leaves and branches. The whistling grew louder, accompanied by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. A rider was approaching. Eliza held her breath as a tall man on a chestnut horse came into view. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, but his broad shoulders and the easy way he sat in the saddle marked him as someone who'd spent his life on horseback. A cowboy, by the looks of him, probably working for whoever owned the orchard. The man dismounted gracefully and tied his horse to a nearby fence post. He walked among the trees, occasionally reaching up to test the firmness of an apple or examining the condition of a branch. Eliza remained frozen, hardly daring to breathe as he moved closer to her hiding place. When he was directly beneath her tree, the man stopped. Eliza watched as he tilted his head back, his gaze scanning the branches until it settled directly on her. Her heart sank. "I know you're up there," he called, his voice deep and calm. "Been watching you dart between these trees for the past couple nights from my cabin window." Eliza said nothing, weighing her options. She could try to climb higher, but the branches above her were too thin to support her weight. She could jump down and run, but the man stood between her and the easiest escape route, and she was weak from days of little food and less sleep. "Look," the man continued when she didn't respond. "I don't know what you're running from, but you're on my property now, and I'd prefer to know who's living in my apple trees." After a moment's hesitation, Eliza shifted position, wincing as her stiff muscles protested. She began to climb down, keeping a wary eye on the stranger. When she dropped to the ground, she stayed crouched, ready to bolt if necessary. The man kept his distance, seeming to understand her fear. In the clear light of morning, Eliza could see him properly. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with sun-browned skin and deep blue eyes that studied her with curiosity rather than threat. A few days' worth of stubble darkened his jaw, and a scar ran along his right cheekbone. "Name's Mason Reed," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "This is my orchard, and you are—" "Eliza," she replied, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Eliza Morgan." Mason nodded, his gaze moving to the dried blood on her sleeve. "You're hurt." Eliza's hand went to her arm protectively. "It's just a scratch." "Bullet scratch by the look of it," Mason observed, "which means you're either a thief or in some kind of trouble." "I'm not a thief," Eliza said quickly, drawing herself up despite her exhaustion. A ghost of a smile crossed Mason's face. "Then you're in trouble." "Sheriff Davis's kind of trouble, I'd wager, given the men who were asking around about a woman matching your description in town yesterday." Terror gripped Eliza's heart. "They're still looking for me," Mason nodded. "They are, but they won't find you here unless you want to be found." He gestured toward a small cabin visible in the distance, beyond the orchard. "No one's coming for you here, Miss Morgan, not on my land." Eliza stared at him, confusion and suspicion warring within her. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "I know enough," Mason said simply. "I know that Sheriff Davis is in William Anderson's pocket, and I know that Anderson isn't the kind of man who pursues a woman for any decent reason." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "And I know what it's like to be hunted." Eliza swayed on her feet, the past days of fear and exhaustion suddenly catching up with her. Mason moved forward quickly, catching her arm to steady her. "You need food, water, and rest," he said firmly. "And that arm needs tending. Come to the cabin. If you don't like what you find there, you're free to leave. You have my word." Too weary to argue, Eliza allowed Mason to lead her toward the cabin, though she kept a careful distance between them. As they walked, he explained that he lived alone, having purchased the small orchard 5 years earlier after leaving his job as a ranch hand in Texas. "It's not much," Mason said as they approached the cabin, "but it's quiet and folks around here tend to mind their own business." The cabin was indeed small, just one main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and a few shelves holding books and supplies. A door at the back presumably led to a storage area or another small room. Despite its size, the cabin was tidy and well kept. Mason gestured for Eliza to sit at the table while he poured water from a pitcher into a basin. He retrieved a small wooden box from a shelf and set it on the table. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her injured arm. Eliza hesitated, then nodded, allowing him to roll up her sleeve. The bullet graze was angry and red, though thankfully not deep enough to require stitches. Mason cleaned the wound carefully, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he applied a salve and wrapped a clean bandage around her arm. "Thank you," Eliza murmured as he finished. Mason nodded, moving to the small stove where he lit a fire and set a pot of water to boil. "You should eat something," he said, slicing bread from a loaf and setting it before her with a chunk of cheese and some dried apple slices. As Eliza ate, Mason busied himself making coffee, giving her space and time to collect herself. When the coffee was ready, he poured 2 cups and sat across from her, his expression serious. "I won't ask you to tell me why they are after you if you don't want to," he said. "But if I'm going to help you, I need to know what kind of danger I might be facing." Eliza wrapped her hands around the warm cup, drawing strength from its heat. "William Anderson owns the biggest silver mine in Sweetwater Creek," she began, her voice low. "He also owns most of the businesses in town, including the boarding house where I worked as a housekeeper." She took a sip of coffee before continuing. 3 nights ago, I was cleaning one of the upstairs rooms when I overheard Anderson talking with a man I didn't recognize. They were discussing how they'd been watering down the whiskey at Anderson's saloon with wood alcohol to save money. Eliza's hands tightened around her cup. 4 men died last month after drinking at that saloon. The doctor said it was cholera, but I heard Anderson laughing about how much cheaper it was to pay off the doctor than to buy proper whiskey. Mason's expression darkened. "And they realized you overheard." Eliza nodded. "Anderson caught me listening. He tried to grab me, but I managed to get away. I ran straight to Sheriff Davis, thinking he would help." She laughed bitterly. "Instead, he locked me in a cell and sent a deputy to fetch Anderson. I heard them talking about how they needed to take care of the problem before I could tell anyone else." "How did you escape?" "Deputy Jenkins has a soft spot for me," Eliza said. "He slipped me the key when the sheriff stepped out, told me to run and not look back." Her voice caught. "They started shooting as soon as they realized I was gone." Mason was silent for a long moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "Anderson's a powerful man with connections all the way to Denver," he said finally. "And if Sheriff Davis is involved, going to the law isn't an option." "I just need to rest for a day or two," Eliza said quickly. "Then I'll move on. I don't want to bring trouble to your door." Mason shook his head. "You can't outrun men like Anderson, not on foot and not with the whole territory looking for you. You need a plan." He leaned back in his chair, considering. "For now, you can stay here. I have a small room at the back where I store supplies. There's enough space for a pallet." "It's not much, but it's better than sleeping in a tree." Relief washed over Eliza, followed quickly by suspicion. "Why are you helping me? What do you want in return?" Mason met her gaze steadily. "Not everyone has an angle, Miss Morgan. Sometimes people help because it's the right thing to do." He stood up, gathering the empty dishes. "Rest today. Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do next." True to his word, Mason showed Eliza to the small storeroom at the back of the cabin. It was cramped but clean, with sacks of flour and sugar stacked neatly against one wall and tools hanging from pegs on another. Mason cleared a space in the corner and made up a pallet with blankets and a pillow from his own bed. "It's not much," he apologized, "but it should be comfortable enough for now." Eliza could barely keep her eyes open as exhaustion overtook her. "Thank you," she managed to say before sleep claimed her. When Eliza woke, golden afternoon light was streaming through the cabin's small windows. For a moment she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings sending a jolt of panic through her, until she remembered where she was in Mason Reed's cabin, hidden away from Anderson's men. She rose stiffly, her body aching from days of tension and poor sleep. The main room of the cabin was empty, but a pitcher of water, a basin, and a bar of soap had been left on the table, along with a neatly folded shirt and a pair of trousers that would clearly be too large for her but were cleaner than her own travel-stained clothes. After washing and changing, Eliza felt somewhat more human. The shirt was indeed too big, hanging almost to her knees, but she rolled up the sleeves and tucked it into the trousers, which she secured with a length of rope as a makeshift belt. Her own boots were still serviceable enough. Curious about her benefactor, Eliza looked around the cabin more carefully. The shelves held an eclectic collection of novels by Dickens and Twain, practical guides to farming and animal husbandry, and several volumes of poetry, their spines well worn from frequent reading. A rifle hung over the fireplace, well maintained but clearly used. On the small table beside the bed sat a daguerreotype in a simple frame, showing a younger Mason standing beside an older man and woman, all three smiling slightly at the camera. The sound of approaching footsteps made Eliza tense, but it was only Mason returning from his work in the orchard. He paused in the doorway, seeming surprised to find her up and about. "You look better," he observed, setting down a basket of apples. "How's the arm?" "Sore, but better," Eliza replied. "Thank you for the clothes." Mason nodded, moving to wash his hands in a basin by the door. "They were my mother's," he explained. "I keep meaning to pass them along to someone who could use them, but I never seem to get around to it." "Was that her in the picture?" Eliza asked, gesturing to the daguerreotype. A shadow crossed Mason's face. "Yes, my parents. They died in a fire 5 years ago." He didn't elaborate further, and Eliza didn't press. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Mason shrugged, his expression clearing. "It was a long time ago." He changed the subject. "Are you hungry? I was about to start supper." Together, they prepared a simple meal of rabbit stew with vegetables from Mason's small garden. As they worked side by side, Eliza found herself relaxing slightly for the first time in days. Mason was easy to be around, asking no intrusive questions and seeming content with companionable silence. Over supper, Mason shared a little about his life. He'd grown up on a cattle ranch in Texas, the son of a foreman. After his parents died, he'd left Texas, drifting west until he found this small piece of land for sale just outside the town of Pine Ridge, Colorado. "The soil here is good for apples," he explained. "I sell them to the mercantile in town and to passing wagon trains. It's not much of a living, but it's peaceful." "It sounds lovely," Eliza said, surprising herself with her sincerity. After the chaos and fear of the past days, Mason's simple, quiet life seemed idyllic. Mason smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "It can be lonely," he admitted. "But after years of bunkhouses full of cowhands and cattle drives with never a moment's privacy, lonely has its appeal." As night fell, they sat before the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Mason brought out a bottle of whiskey, pouring a small measure for each of them. "Real whiskey," he assured her with a faint smile. "Not Anderson's poison." Eliza sipped the amber liquid, feeling it burn a path down her throat and settle warmly in her stomach. "What do you think I should do?" she asked finally, voicing the question that had been weighing on her mind. "I can't hide in your storeroom forever." Mason stared into the fire, thoughtful. "You could go to Denver," he suggested, "or further west to California, start fresh where Anderson can't reach you." "I have no money," Eliza pointed out, "no family, no connections, and Anderson has both." "You have a little time," Mason said. "Anderson might have influence, but even he can't keep men searching for you indefinitely. Eventually, they'll assume you've moved on or died in the wilderness. And until then," Mason met her gaze steadily, "until then, you stay here. I have work that needs doing, and an extra pair of hands would be welcome. You can earn your keep and save a little money while we wait for the search to die down." Eliza studied him, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motives, but found only open honesty in his blue eyes. "Why would you take such a risk for a stranger?" Mason was quiet for a long moment. "I told you I know what it's like to be hunted," he said finally. "What I didn't tell you is why." He took a long sip of whiskey. "Back in Texas, I worked for a man named James Harlow. He was rich, powerful, and as cruel as they come. I witnessed him murder a young cowhand who'd accidentally stampeded a herd. When I tried to bring Harlow to justice, I found myself on the wrong side of the law instead." "What happened?" Eliza asked softly. "Harlow owned the sheriff, just like Anderson owns Davis," Mason said, his voice tight with old anger. "I barely escaped with my life, left everything behind and didn't stop running until I reached Colorado." He looked up at her. "So you see, Miss Morgan, I understand your situation better than most." The revelation created a new bond between them, a shared understanding of what it meant to stand alone against powerful enemies. As the fire burned low, Eliza found herself telling Mason about her own life, how she'd been orphaned at 16 when influenza took both her parents, how she'd worked her way west from job to job until she ended up in Sweetwater Creek. "I've always been alone," she concluded, surprised by the lack of self-pity in her voice. It was simply a fact of her existence. "Not anymore," Mason said quietly. "At least, not for now." The next morning, Eliza woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She dressed quickly and joined Mason in the main room where he was setting plates on the table. "I hope you don't mind an early start," he said. "The apples in the north section need thinning, and it's best to do it before the day gets too hot." After breakfast, Mason led Eliza to the orchard, explaining the work as they went. "The trees set more fruit than they can support," he told her, demonstrating how to examine each cluster of small green apples and remove the smallest or misshapen ones. "If we don't thin them, we end up with lots of tiny, worthless apples instead of fewer good ones." The work was straightforward but required attention and care. Mason worked alongside Eliza, showing patience when she was unsure and offering praise when she got the hang of it. By midday, they had completed several rows of trees, and Eliza's hands were stained with apple sap. "You're a quick learner," Mason commented as they sat in the shade to eat the lunch they'd brought with them: bread, cheese, and slices of dried beef. "It's not so different from other work I've done," Eliza replied, "and it's peaceful here." Mason nodded, his gaze sweeping over the neat rows of trees. "That's why I chose this place. After years of chaos, I wanted somewhere quiet where I could build something of my own." After lunch, they returned to work, finishing another section of the orchard before the sun began to sink toward the western mountains. As they walked back to the cabin, Eliza found herself noticing things she'd been too tired or frightened to appreciate before: the way the late afternoon light turned the leaves golden, the sweet scent of ripening fruit in the air, the distant call of birds settling for the night. Days passed in a similar pattern. During the day, Eliza worked alongside Mason in the orchard or helped with chores around the cabin. In the evenings, they shared simple meals and conversation before the fire. Mason proved to be well-read and thoughtful, and Eliza found herself enjoying their discussions about books he lent her or stories from their respective pasts. A week into her stay, Mason returned from a trip to town with supplies and news. "They're still looking for you," he reported, unloading sacks of flour and sugar from his packhorse. "But not as actively. The story is that you robbed Anderson and shot a deputy while escaping." Eliza's hands clenched into fists. "That's a lie." "I never stole anything, and I certainly didn't shoot anyone." "Of course it's a lie," Mason agreed calmly, "but it's a useful one for Anderson. It makes you the villain and him the victim. Did you hear anything about Deputy Jenkins?" Eliza asked, worried about the young man who had helped her escape. Mason's expression grew grim. "He's dead. Found in the creek 2 days after you fled. The official story is that he was killed trying to apprehend you." Eliza sank onto a chair, guilt and grief washing over her. "He was kind to me," she whispered. "He didn't deserve that." Mason set down the supplies and came to sit beside her. "Anderson killed him, not you," he said firmly. "Remember that. Jenkins made his choice when he helped you escape. He knew the risks." "As do you," Eliza pointed out, looking up at him. "Every day I stay here puts you in danger." "I made my choice too," Mason said simply. That night, Eliza tossed and turned on her pallet, haunted by thoughts of Jenkins and the danger she had brought to Mason's door. Eventually, she rose and slipped quietly into the main room of the cabin, intending to get a drink of water. She was surprised to find Mason still awake, sitting at the table with a lamp burning low, a book open before him. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening at the sight of her in her borrowed nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. Eliza shook her head. "I keep thinking about Jenkins, about how Anderson will never face justice for what he's done." Mason closed his book. "There are different kinds of justice in this world," he said. "Not all of them come from a courtroom." "What do you mean?" "I mean that men like Anderson eventually pay for their crimes one way or another," Mason said. "Their kind make enemies, and sooner or later one of those enemies strikes back." Eliza poured herself a glass of water, considering his words. "That's not justice," she said finally. "That's just more violence." Mason shrugged. "Perhaps, but it's often all the justice available to people like us." "Is that why you never went back to Texas?" Eliza asked. "Never tried to clear your name?" A shadow crossed Mason's face. "My name doesn't need clearing. Harlow was the criminal, not me." "But you're still hiding," Eliza pointed out gently, "just like I am." Mason was silent for a long moment. "Yes," he admitted finally. "I suppose I am." The admission seemed to cost him, and Eliza regretted pushing. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have presumed to understand your situation." Mason shook his head. "No, you're right. I've been hiding here, telling myself I was building a new life, when really I've just been running from the old one." He looked up at her, his blue eyes intent in the lamplight. "Maybe we both need to stop running." The intensity of his gaze made Eliza's heart beat faster. There was something new in the way Mason was looking at her, something that had nothing to do with her status as a fugitive or his as her protector. For the first time, she was acutely aware of him as a man, and of herself as a woman. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Then Mason cleared his throat and stood up, breaking the spell. "It's late," he said, his voice rough. "We should both try to get some sleep." Eliza nodded, suddenly shy. "Good night, Mason. Good night, Eliza." As she returned to her small room, Eliza found herself wondering what might have happened if she had been brave enough to cross the space between them, to acknowledge the attraction that had been building over the past week. But such thoughts were foolish. She was in no position to think of romance, not with Anderson and his men still hunting her. Yet as she drifted off to sleep, it was Mason's face she saw, his blue eyes warm with an emotion she was not yet ready to name. The next morning brought an unexpected change to their routine. After breakfast, Mason announced that he needed to check on the beehives he kept at the far edge of his property. "I'd like you to come with me," he said. "If you're willing to learn, I could use help with the honey harvest next month." Eliza agreed readily, curious about this aspect of Mason's farm that she hadn't yet seen. They walked together through the orchard and beyond, into a meadow dotted with wildflowers where several white wooden boxes stood in a neat row. "The bees pollinate the apple blossoms in spring," Mason explained as they approached, "and they provide honey that I sell in town along with the apples. It's a good arrangement for all of us." He showed Eliza how to approach the hives calmly, moving slowly and speaking in a low, steady voice. "Bees respond to fear and aggression," he told her. "If you're peaceful, they generally leave you alone." To Eliza's surprise, Mason opened one of the hives without wearing any protective gear, exposing frames thick with honeycomb and buzzing with bees. The insects crawled over his hands and arms as he worked, but he remained calm and none of them stung him. "Would you like to try?" he asked, holding out a frame for her inspection. Eliza hesitated, eyeing the bees warily. "I'm not sure I have your confidence." Mason smiled. "It's not about confidence, it's about respect. The bees are just going about their business. They don't want to sting you any more than you want to be stung." Gathering her courage, Eliza stepped forward and carefully took the frame from Mason. The weight of it surprised her, as did the warmth emanating from the busy colony. She watched, fascinated, as the bees moved purposefully across the honeycomb, their tiny bodies gleaming in the sunlight. "They're beautiful," she murmured. Mason nodded, his expression soft as he watched her. "They are, and each one knows exactly what its purpose is, what it needs to do to help the colony survive." "Unlike people," Eliza observed. "Unlike some people," Mason corrected gently. "I think you know your purpose, Eliza Morgan, you just haven't had the freedom to pursue it." The observation struck Eliza as both perceptive and true. Before overhearing Anderson's conversation, she had been saving money to open a small bakery of her own someday, drawing on the skills her mother had taught her. It was a modest dream, but it had been hers. "Perhaps," she acknowledged. "But dreams require security, and I have precious little of that at the moment." Mason took the frame back from her and returned it to the hive. "Security can be built," he said, "with time and the right foundation." As they walked back to the cabin, Eliza found herself wondering if Mason was offering more than just temporary shelter, if, perhaps, he was suggesting that she could find a permanent place here with him. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. That evening, as they prepared supper together, the easy companionship that had developed between them seemed overlaid with a new awareness, a tension that made Eliza hyper-conscious of every accidental brush of hands or momentary meeting of eyes. After they had eaten, Mason surprised her by retrieving a fiddle from the trunk at the foot of his bed. "My father taught me to play," he explained, seeing her curious look. "It's been a while, but I thought you might enjoy some music." He began to play, the fiddle's sweet, melancholy notes filling the small cabin. The tune was one Eliza recognized, a folk song about love and longing that her mother had often sung while working. Without thinking, she began to sing along softly, her clear voice blending with the fiddle's plaintive cry. Mason looked up, surprised and pleased, and played on, moving from one familiar tune to another as Eliza sang. When they finally stopped, the silence seemed especially profound, filled with something unspoken but increasingly difficult to ignore. "You have a beautiful voice," Mason said quietly. "Thank you," Eliza replied. "It's been a long time since I sang for anyone." Mason set the fiddle aside. "Why did you stop?" Eliza shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "There hasn't been much to sing about in recent years." "And now?" Mason asked, his gaze steady on hers. "Now." Eliza hesitated, unsure how to articulate the mix of fear, gratitude, and growing affection she felt. "Now I'm finding my voice again, I suppose." Mason smiled, the expression warming his serious face. "I'm glad," he said simply. In that moment, Eliza realized with startling clarity that she was falling in love with this quiet, steady man who had taken her in without question and asked for nothing in return. The recognition should have frightened her. She was still in danger, still uncertain of her future, but instead, it filled her with a strange, sweet hope. As the days passed, Eliza and Mason fell into a comfortable routine, working side by side in the orchard, tending the beehives and sharing the daily chores of the cabin. Eliza began cooking more of their meals, rediscovering her love of baking as she experimented with the apples from the orchard, creating pies and tarts that made Mason's eyes light up with appreciation. "You could sell these in town," he commented one evening as he helped himself to a second slice of apple pie. "They're better than anything Mrs. Holloway offers at the bakery." Eliza shook her head, though the compliment warmed her. "I can't go into town. Anderson might have men watching." "Not forever," Mason pointed out. "Eventually they'll give up the search." "Perhaps," Eliza conceded, "but Anderson doesn't strike me as a man who forgets or forgives easily." Mason was silent for a moment, considering, what if there was a way to neutralize the threat, he asked finally. "A way to ensure Anderson could never harm you or anyone else again." Eliza looked up sharply. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," Mason admitted, "but I've been thinking about what you told me about Anderson poisoning those men with bad whiskey. If we could find evidence of that, perhaps we could use it to our advantage." "How?" "Sheriff Davis is in Anderson's pocket, and there's no higher law to appeal to in Sweetwater Creek." "No, but there is in Denver," Mason said. "The territorial governor has been cracking down on corruption lately. If we could get evidence to him, bypass Davis entirely." The idea was both tantalizing and terrifying. "It would be incredibly dangerous," Eliza said slowly. "Anderson would kill us both if he caught us trying to gather evidence against him." "Yes," Mason agreed. "But it might be the only way to truly free you. Otherwise, you'll always be looking over your shoulder, always wondering if today is the day Anderson's men find you." Eliza knew he was right. As peaceful and fulfilling as her life with Mason had become, it was built on a foundation of sand as long as Anderson remained a threat. And it wasn't just her own safety at stake anymore. Mason was in danger too, simply by harboring her. "Let me think about it," she said finally. That night, lying on her pallet in the storeroom, Eliza turned the problem over in her mind. The thought of actively moving against Anderson filled her with dread, but the alternative, a lifetime of hiding and fear, was equally unappealing. And there was another consideration now. Her growing feelings for Mason and the possibility of a future with him that she had begun to imagine in quiet moments. A future that would never be secure as long as Anderson lived. With that thought, Eliza made her decision. The next morning over breakfast, she told Mason she was willing to try his plan. "But we need to be careful," she insisted. "Anderson is dangerous, and I won't risk your life unnecessarily." Mason reached across the table and took her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "We'll be careful," he promised. and we'll do this together." Together, they began to formulate a plan. Mason had a friend in Pine Ridge, a telegraph operator named Michael Jenkins, who could be trusted to send messages to the territorial governor's office in Denver without raising suspicions. But first, they needed proof of Anderson's crimes that would be compelling enough to prompt an official investigation. The doctor who falsified the death certificates might be willing to talk, Eliza suggested. "Dr. Sanders is a good man at heart, I think." "He probably went along with Anderson out of fear rather than greed." Mason nodded thoughtfully. "It's possible, but approaching him directly would be risky. Anderson likely has him watched." "What about the shipments of wood alcohol?" Eliza asked. "Anderson must be getting it from somewhere." "If we could trace the supply." "That's a better angle," Mason agreed. "I have a contact in Denver who might be able to help a former ranger who now works as a private investigator. If Anderson is importing wood alcohol in quantity, there would be records." Over the next few days, they refined their plan. Mason would make a trip to Denver, ostensibly to arrange for the sale of his apple crop but actually to meet with his investigator friend and send a carefully worded message to the governor's office outlining their suspicions. Meanwhile, Eliza would remain at the orchard, continuing the work and maintaining the appearance of normalcy in case anyone came looking for Mason. The night before Mason was to leave, they sat together by the fire, going over the details one final time. The late September air had a chill to it, and Eliza had wrapped herself in a shawl that Mason had purchased for her on his last trip to town. "If all goes well, I'll be back within a week," Mason said. "Sooner if possible." Eliza nodded, trying to hide her anxiety. In the month she had been at the orchard, she had never been completely alone. The thought of Mason leaving, even temporarily, filled her with a nameless dread. "You'll be safe here," Mason assured her, reading her expression. "No one comes to the orchard except the buyers I've arranged for, and they won't arrive until after I'm back." "I'm not worried about myself," Eliza said honestly. "I'm worried about you if Anderson discovers what you're doing." Mason's expression softened. "I'll be careful," he promised. "Anderson has no reason to suspect me. As far as anyone knows, I'm just an apple farmer with no connection to Sweetwater Creek or its scandals." Eliza wanted to believe him, but fear had become such a constant companion that it was hard to set aside. "Just come back safely," she said softly. "That's all I ask." Mason reached out and took her hand, his blue eyes serious in the firelight. "I will," he said. "I have every reason to come back now." The simple statement carried a weight of meaning that made Eliza's heart beat faster. For a moment they sat in silence, hands clasped, the unspoken growing between them like a living thing. Then Mason leaned forward and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, questioning rather than demanding, and Eliza found herself responding with a fervor that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, Mason's eyes were dark with emotion. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted, his voice rough. "Why didn't you?" Eliza asked, breathless. Mason's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "I didn't want you to think I expected anything in return for helping you, and I wasn't sure if you felt the same way." "I do," Eliza said simply. "I have for some time now." The admission changed something between them, breaking down the last barrier of reserve. Mason pulled her into his arms, and Eliza went willingly, marveling at how right it felt to be held by him, how naturally they fit together. They spent the night talking by the fire, sharing hopes and fears and dreams they had kept hidden. Mason spoke of his desire to expand the orchard, perhaps plant cherry and peach trees alongside the apples. Eliza confessed her old dream of opening a bakery, using the fruits from Mason's orchard to create pies and pastries. "We could do it together," Mason suggested, his arm around her shoulders. "Once Anderson is no longer a threat, the Mercantile in Pine Ridge has space for a bakery counter, and Mrs. Holloway is looking to retire." The casual "we" in his statement made Eliza's heart swell with hope. "I'd like that," she said softly. As dawn approached, Mason reluctantly rose to prepare for his journey. Eliza helped him pack provisions for the trail and stood with him as he saddled his horse, not wanting to waste a moment of their remaining time together. "Be careful," she said as he mounted, "and hurry back." Mason leaned down from the saddle and kissed her once more. "I will," he promised. "Wait for me." "Always," Eliza replied, and meant it with her whole heart. She stood watching as Mason rode away, his figure growing smaller until it disappeared around the bend in the road. Only then did she return to the cabin, which felt strangely empty without his presence. The first day of Mason's absence passed uneventfully. Eliza kept busy with chores, harvesting ripe apples and storing them in the root cellar beneath the cabin, cleaning and organizing the main room, and baking bread for Mason's return. The physical activity helped distract her from her worries, but as night fell, the silence of the cabin became oppressive. To comfort herself, Eliza took out Mason's fiddle and ran her fingers over the strings, producing a discordant jumble of notes. She had never played any instrument, but the fiddle connected her to Mason, and holding it made her feel less alone. On the second day, Eliza was in the orchard checking the ripeness of a section of late-bearing trees when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Her heart leapt with hope that Mason had somehow completed his business in Denver and returned early, but caution made her retreat to the shelter of the trees before the rider came into view. It wasn't Mason. Instead, a stranger on a bay horse came riding up to the cabin. He was a tall man with a weathered face and a star pinned to his vest, a lawman. Though not one Eliza recognized from Sweetwater Creek, fear made her throat tight as she watched from hiding. The man dismounted and knocked on the cabin door. When there was no answer, he circled the building, peering in windows and examining the ground around the cabin with the practiced eye of a tracker. After a few minutes, the man remounted his horse and rode slowly around the perimeter of the cleared land, his gaze sweeping the orchard. Eliza pressed herself against the trunk of an apple tree, praying he wouldn't spot her among the foliage. Just when she thought the man would leave, he turned his horse directly toward her section of the orchard. Panic rose in Eliza's chest. There was nowhere to run without being seen, and the trees weren't dense enough to provide real cover if he came looking for her. Making a split-second decision, Eliza picked up her basket of apples and stepped out from behind the tree, trying to appear as if she had been working there all along. If the man was looking for her specifically, running would only confirm her identity. Better to brazen it out and hope he was looking for someone else. The lawman spotted her immediately and rode toward her, his expression unreadable. "Good afternoon, madam," he called as he approached. Eliza forced herself to stand her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. "Good afternoon, sir," she replied, keeping her voice steady with effort. The man reined in his horse a few yards away from her. "I'm Deputy Marshal Evers from the Pine Ridge office," he introduced himself. "I'm looking for Mason Reed. This is his property, isn't it?" "Yes, it is," Eliza confirmed, relief washing through her that the man wasn't asking for her by name. "But Mr. Reed isn't here at present. He's gone to Denver on business." The marshal's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you are?" Eliza had prepared for this question during the long hours of Mason's absence. "Eleanor Martin," she said, using the alias they had agreed upon. "Mr. Reed hired me to help with the harvest while he's away." Marshal Evers studied her for a moment. "You're not from around here, are you, Miss Martin?" "No, sir," Eliza said. "I'm from Denver originally. I'm staying in Mr. Reed's storeroom while I work for him." The marshal nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied with her explanation. "When do you expect Mr. Reed to return?" "In about a week," Eliza replied, sticking to the timeline Mason had given her. "Is there a message I can pass along to him?" "Just tell him that Marshal Evers stopped by," the man said. "I have some questions for him about a man who might have passed through this area recently." Eliza's heart skipped a beat. "What man would that be, Marshal?" Evers dismounted, his movements deliberate. "A fugitive from justice," he said, watching her face carefully. "A dangerous one. He killed a deputy down in Sweetwater Creek and robbed one of the most prominent citizens there." So the marshal was looking for her after all, just under the assumption that she was a man. The realization brought a grim sort of humor along with renewed fear. "That sounds terrible," she said, trying to sound appropriately shocked. "But I haven't seen anyone suspicious around here, just Mr. Reed and now you." Marshal Evers seemed to accept this, but instead of leaving, he gestured to her basket. "Those apples look mighty fine," he commented. "Mind if I try one?" "Of course not," Eliza said, offering the basket. As the marshal selected an apple, she noticed him glancing toward the cabin and then back at her, his expression speculative. "You know," he said conversationally, "it's strange. I've known Mason Reed for 3 years now, and he's never mentioned hiring help before. Always said he preferred to work alone." Eliza's mouth went dry. "Perhaps the harvest is larger this year," she suggested. The marshal took a bite of the apple, chewing thoughtfully. "Perhaps," he agreed. "Or perhaps there's another reason he wanted someone staying at his place while he's away." Before Eliza could respond, Marshal Evers tossed the half-eaten apple aside and fixed her with a hard stare. "I think we should continue this conversation at the cabin, Miss Martin, or should I say, Miss Morgan?" Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. "I don't know what you're talking about," she protested, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "I think you do," the marshal said. "There's a wanted poster with your description circulating all over the territory. It says you're armed and dangerous, but somehow I doubt that." He gestured toward the cabin. "Shall we?" Seeing no alternative, Eliza walked ahead of the marshal back to the cabin, her mind racing. If he was going to arrest her, why hadn't he done so immediately? And how had he known to look for her here? Once inside, Marshal Evers motioned for Eliza to sit at the table while he remained standing, his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Now," he said, "I'd like to hear your side of the story, Miss Morgan, because frankly, you don't look much like a cold-blooded killer to me." The unexpected statement gave Eliza a flicker of hope. Carefully, she told the marshal everything about overhearing Anderson's conversation, about the men who had died from poisoned whiskey, about her escape from jail and Deputy Jenkins's help. "I never stole anything from Anderson," she concluded. "And I certainly didn't kill anyone. The only thing I'm guilty of is overhearing something I wasn't supposed to hear." Marshal Evers listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "That lines up with what Mason Reed told us," he said. Eliza stared at him in confusion. "What?" The marshal smiled slightly. "Reed didn't go to Denver just to sell apples, Miss Morgan. He came to the marshal's office in Pine Ridge 2 days ago with a story about William Anderson poisoning men with bad whiskey and a corrupt sheriff covering it up. Said he had a witness who was being falsely accused of crimes to discredit her testimony." Relief and bewilderment warred within Eliza. "But if Mason told you about me, why did you pretend not to know who I was?" "I needed to hear your version of events directly," Evers explained. "To see if it matched Reed's, and I needed to be sure you weren't being coerced or manipulated into supporting his story." "And are you satisfied now?" Eliza asked. The marshal nodded. "I am. Reed's story checked out in other ways too. We've had reports of similar deaths in other towns where Anderson does business, and Reed isn't the first person to suggest that Sheriff Davis is on Anderson's payroll." "So what happens now?" Eliza asked, hardly daring to hope. "Now," Marshal Evers said, "we build a case against Anderson and Davis. The territorial governor has authorized a full investigation, but it will take time to gather evidence that will stand up in court." "And what about me?" Eliza pressed. "Am I still a fugitive?" The marshal's expression softened slightly. "Officially, yes, until we can clear your name. But unofficially, you're under the protection of the U.S. Marshal's Office as a material witness. That means you should stay here out of sight until we're ready to move against Anderson." The news was better than Eliza had dared to hope for. "And Mason, where is he now?" "Reed is meeting with the governor's representatives in Denver," Evers told her. "He should be back in a few days. In the meantime, I'll be keeping an eye on this place from a distance." If anyone suspicious comes around, you get yourself hidden and stay that way until I or Reed come for you. Understood, Eliza nodded, overwhelmed by this unexpected turn of events. Thank you, Marshal, she said sincerely. Evers tipped his hat. Don't thank me yet, Miss Morgan. We've still got a long road ahead of us. Anderson won't go down without a fight. After the marshal left, Eliza sat for a long time at the table, trying to process everything she had learned. Mason had done more than just seek help. He had set in motion a full investigation that could bring down Anderson and clear her name. The risk he had taken for her, a woman he had known for barely a month, was staggering. And yet, as she thought about it, Eliza realized it was entirely in character for the man she had come to love. Mason's quiet strength, his unwavering sense of justice, his willingness to stand up for what was right regardless of personal cost, these were the qualities that had drawn her to him from the beginning. The days of Mason's absence seemed to crawl by, but Eliza kept busy with work around the orchard, finding comfort in the routine tasks and in the knowledge that he was working to secure her freedom. Each night, she slept in Mason's bed rather than on her pallet in the storeroom, finding solace in being surrounded by his scent and his belongings. On the morning of the 6th day, Eliza was kneading dough for bread when she heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Her heart leapt and she hurried to the door, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. Mason dismounted wearily from his horse, his face showing the strain of hard travel. But when he saw Eliza in the doorway, his expression transformed, weariness giving way to joy. In 3 long strides, he was at the cabin, gathering her into his arms. "You're safe," he murmured against her hair. "Thank God." Eliza held him tightly, breathing in the scent of him horse and dust from the trail, but underneath, the familiar scent that was uniquely Mason. "Marshal Evers told me what you did," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "How you went to him and the governor." Mason drew back slightly to look at her. "I should have told you that was my plan," he said, "but I was afraid you'd try to stop me, afraid you'd think it was too dangerous." It was dangerous, Eliza agreed, but it was also brave and right. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Thank you for believing in me, for fighting for me." Mason turned his head to press a kiss into her palm. "I'd do it again," he said simply. 1,000 times over. They went inside, and as Mason washed away the dust of travel, he told Eliza about his meetings in Denver. The governor had been persuaded by the evidence Mason and Marshal Evers had presented and had authorized a special prosecutor to build a case against Anderson and Sheriff Davis. The investigation would be conducted quietly to prevent them from destroying evidence or fleeing the territory. "It will take time," Mason cautioned. "Months probably, but when it's done you'll be free, Eliza, truly free." The prospect was almost too wonderful to believe. "And until then," she asked. Mason took her hands in his. "Until then, you stay here where I can protect you. Where we can build something together if that's what you want." "It is," Eliza said without hesitation, "more than anything." The smile that spread across Mason's face was like the sun breaking through clouds. "In that case," he said, reaching into his pocket, "I have something for you." He pulled out a simple gold band, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. "I bought this in Denver," he explained, suddenly looking uncertain. "I know it's fast, and I know we still have obstacles to overcome, but I want you to know that I'm serious about us, about our future together." Eliza stared at the ring, her heart pounding. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she whispered. Mason nodded. "I am. Not right away, not until your name is cleared and you're truly free. But yes, Eliza Morgan, I'm asking you to be my wife, to build a life with me here or wherever you want to go." Tears sprang to Eliza's eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you, Mason Reid." Mason slipped the ring onto her finger and then he was kissing her, his arms around her waist, lifting her off her feet in his exuberance. Eliza laughed against his mouth, dizzy with happiness. That night, they shared Mason's bed for the first time, not as fugitive and protector but as lovers, as future husband and wife. In the warmth of his embrace, Eliza found a peace she had never known before, a sense of belonging and safety that went beyond the physical protection Mason offered. "I love you," she whispered in the darkness, saying the words aloud for the first time. Mason's arms tightened around her. "And I love you," he replied, "more than I thought possible." In the weeks that followed, Eliza and Mason settled into a new rhythm of shared work and shared dreams. By day, they harvested the apple crop together, Mason teaching Eliza the intricacies of selecting, sorting, and storing the fruit for maximum profit. In the evenings, they planned for the future, discussing improvements to the orchard, sketching designs for a larger cabin, and refining Eliza's vision for her bakery. Marshal Evers visited periodically, bringing news of the investigation's progress. Anderson and Sheriff Davis remained unaware of the case building against them, continuing their corrupt practices in Sweetwater Creek, while the special prosecutor gathered evidence from victims and witnesses across the territory. As autumn deepened into winter, Eliza and Mason were married in a small ceremony in Pine Ridge, with Marshal Evers and his wife as witnesses. It was a quiet affair, with Eliza still using her alias of Alina Martin for safety, but the joy they felt was no less profound for the secrecy surrounding it. "One day," Mason promised as they drove back to the orchard after the ceremony, "we'll have a proper celebration with your real name and all our friends around us." Eliza, nestled against his side on the wagon seat, smiled up at him. "This was perfect," she assured him. "All that matters is that we're together." Winter brought snow to the orchard, transforming the neat rows of trees into a wonderland of white. Confined to the cabin by the weather, Eliza and Mason spent the cold months planning for spring, ordering new varieties of apple trees and supplies for the expanded orchard. With Mason's encouragement, Eliza also began experimenting with recipes for the bakery they hoped to open once her name was cleared. The cabin was often filled with the aroma of baking as she refined her apple pie recipe and developed new creations: apple dumplings, turnovers, and a spiced apple cake that became Mason's favorite. In January, Marshal Evers arrived at the cabin with momentous news. The special prosecutor had completed his investigation and had secured indictments against William Anderson, Sheriff Davis, and several of their associates for multiple counts of murder, fraud, and corruption. "Anderson was arrested yesterday," Evers reported, accepting a cup of coffee from Eliza with a nod of thanks. "Davis tried to run, but we caught him at the territorial border. They're both in custody in Denver now, awaiting trial." Eliza sank into a chair, overcome by the news. "And my status?" she asked. "Am I still a fugitive?" Marshal Evers smiled. "No, Mrs. Reed. The charges against you have been officially dropped. The governor himself signed the order clearing your name of all wrongdoing. You're free to go wherever you please, use your real name, live your life without fear." The words seemed to hang in the air, almost too wonderful to be believed. Eliza looked at Mason, who was watching her with a mixture of joy and pride. "We did it," she whispered. Mason crossed the room to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "You did it," he corrected gently. "Your courage started all of this. I just helped along the way." Marshal Evers cleared his throat. "There's more," he said. "The governor has authorized restitution for those harmed by Anderson's actions. That includes you, Mrs. Reed. There's a substantial sum waiting for you in Denver, compensation for the false accusations and the danger you were placed in." The news was overwhelming. From fugitive to free woman with the means to build the life she had always dreamed of, the transformation was almost too much to comprehend. That night, after Marshal Evers had gone, Eliza and Mason sat before the fire, planning their future with a new sense of possibility. "We could expand the orchard even more with that money," Mason suggested. "Perhaps buy the adjacent property that Johnson has been trying to sell." "And the bakery in Pine Ridge," Eliza added. "Mrs. Holloway is still looking to retire. We could purchase her business and renovate it." Mason smiled, pulling her closer. "We can do all of it," he agreed. "But first, I think we should take a trip to Denver. Collect your restitution, see Anderson and Davis face justice, and perhaps celebrate our freedom properly." Eliza rested her head on his shoulder, content in a way she had never thought possible when she'd fled Sweetwater Creek all those months ago. "I'd like that," she said. "And then we'll come home and build our life together." "Home," Mason repeated, kissing the top of her head. "Yes, that's exactly what we'll do." Spring came early to the orchard that year, the apple trees bursting into bloom under a warm April sun. Eliza and Mason had returned from Denver with not only the restitution funds, but also a sense of closure. They had watched from the gallery as William Anderson and Sheriff Davis were sentenced to long prison terms for their crimes, their power and influence finally stripped away. Now, as Eliza stood in the doorway of their expanded cabin, watching Mason work with the new saplings they had planted to extend the orchard, she marveled at how far they had come. The bakery in Pine Ridge was being renovated and would open in the summer, offering Eliza's creations to the growing town. The orchard was thriving, with new varieties of apples that would extend their harvest season and increase their income. But most precious of all was the life they had built together, a partnership founded on trust, strengthened by adversity, and sustained by love. As Mason looked up and saw her watching, he smiled and raised a hand in greeting. Eliza smiled back, one hand resting lightly on her abdomen where their child grew, a secret she would share with him that evening. From fugitive to wife, from hiding to homecoming, from fear to love, Eliza's journey had been long and perilous. But as she walked across the sunlit orchard to join her husband, she knew with absolute certainty that every step had led her exactly where she was meant to be.